host for the whole time, and it's either going to be you guys laughing with me or at me. I'm okay with either. So, as long as this can be entertaining for everyone, and you might even learn something, I've accomplished my job. So, that's what I'm going to try to do here. What I would encourage everyone here is, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to participate. There's a couple times where I'm going to encourage audience participation. So, if you can do that, if at all possible, it'll make it more fun for all of us. Likewise, if there's any questions that you have, anything that I say that sounds, something that you want to know more about, if I say something that sounds really stupid, call me out on it, please. Because someone else in the audience is probably thinking the same thing. And we can all learn from that as well. So, without further ado, we'll start getting started and talk about stories through logging. And kind of the impetus for this talk was my managing partner come to me, Tom, we love it when you give presentations, but could you actually give a presentation about what we do? Because Hurricane Labs, we do a lot of work with logging and tools that work with logging. The big one, of course, being Splunk. And I'm going to try to give a talk that talks about logging while saying Splunk as little as possible, which is going to be a challenge. Like I said, call me out on it if I try to do it. I do not want to be someone who's saying to use a certain product. I hate it when someone comes up representing some kind of product or vendor and starts talking about only that solution. So I'm going to try to be as technology agnostic as possible for this presentation, and we will go from there. So logs are one of those things that exist everywhere in an organization. We all have things that produce logs. We have systems that produce logs. How many of you have recently looked at logs? Yes! I love to see that when we have an audience that actually knows that logs exist. Sometimes I would say, like, hey, what about logs? And I just get a bunch of blank stares. And that's really, really depressing. So it's great to hear that you guys at least know that logs exist, so I don't have to worry about that basic fact. So that's awesome. Thank you very much. This is one of those topics, though, we have logs. We're bringing in logs potentially. There's so many sources of logs that we have in our organization. And I want to make this talk something that makes sense of logging and gives you something that you can use as an example when you're trying to talk about logging in the context of maybe some people that aren't all that technical, who don't necessarily understand the value of the logs that you have, and maybe if you're even looking for options or things to do with what your logs are giving you. How many of you are currently running some sort of SIM or logging solution? Decent number. Awesome. How many of you are just kind of scratching the iceberg with that right now? Just getting started, maybe bringing in some types of data. Cool. That's a start there. How many of you would say you're doing a little bit more of an advanced sort of thing? You're bringing in more sources of data. Maybe not just your security team is looking at it, but your development team is working with your log sources. Couple of people, a decent amount. How many of you think your solution is awesome and you have everything you'd ever want? No one. Okay. Well, we'll get there. That's good. There's not going to be the know-it-all in the room that's going to take the microphone away from me. So, without further ado, I'd like to get started with a story, because this is Stories Through Logging. So, let's set the scene. So we have a worldwide financial services organization. We'll just call them Big Bank Incorporated. They have millions of customers around the world. This is an online banking institution. What's something that an online banking institution might have? This is not a trick question. Account numbers, sure. If it's online, how are people going to enter their account numbers? Yes, a website. They probably have more than one website. They might have some web servers. Do you think their customers are going to care if they can get to these web pages? Yeah, of course. So if this is their business, that's something that they care about. And that is something that would be considered one of their most important resources. So what happens when something goes wrong? What happens when there's a problem? What happens when that website is impacted? That brings us to April 7th, 2015, May Day. So what's happening? The e-commerce site, it's crawling. Obviously a bad thing, because online banking and your e-commerce site, you're not able to do online banking things. and that's bad. Your web servers are crashing, and everyone knows when a web server crashes, it splits right down the middle. And that's also bad. Your server administrators aren't happy about that, and your developers are just like, how can I write code on something that's in two pieces? Of course, your business is impacted because you're not able to run the transactions. Your customers can't access the website. They can't do transactions. Everything like that is bad. So obviously, what are you thinking right now? What's going through your head? You're facing this situation. Put yourself in your role, either as an administrator, an auditor, whatever role you have. What are you thinking right now when faced with this situation? What caused it? Sure. Do we know yet with the information I have provided? What might you be thinking is a potential cause? Yeah, I heard it right there. Denial of service attack. What other things might you be thinking? Hardware failure? Sure. You have situations where there are maybe a server having a problem, maybe an application issue, maybe denial of service attack. What types of things and what questions do you have when you're faced with this kind of a situation? Very well. That's an excellent point and definitely something that happens. You have a big situation that's going on, and then out the door they're taking some information and everyone's focusing on the DDoS. Exactly. That's a very good point. It's definitely something that happens. As you said, you've seen it. Exactly. I'll slip you the check for getting to that slide. But yeah, that's a great question that everyone really should be considering when something's happening. What changed? Now, this situation, modified to protect the innocent, is based on a true example that I faced as a security engineer. In this case, this event, where an e-commerce site was impacted severely, and that looked like a very serious denial of service attack, happened right after a firewall upgrade. I was the person who upgraded the firewall, and my firewall upgrade caused the denial of service attack in the eyes of the business. Quote from one of the people there, "Why didn't this happen on the old firewall? We never had this issue." So, how many of you have been in the situation where you have had to either defend or been faced with something that didn't quite seem to make sense like this, but you needed a way to explain it? I'm sure you've seen that happen before. And how do we deal with that? Let's take a step back. We'll get back to that story. This is when I actually get to the title slide of the presentation, where there was a time where I was saying this is where all that Shakespeare that I read in high school came into play, and then someone was like, "Tom, that's not Shakespeare. It's actually Charles Dickens." So it was the best of logs, it was the worst of logs. So I guess I didn't pay too much attention in literature class, but that's good because I only deal with ones and zeros anymore. This is the face I usually get when I start talking about logs. As we've established with you guys, you know about logs, you're here for more. And that's great. But all too often, I see the case where, yes, people are like, well, we have logs for those things? That would be really great if we knew we had those logs. That being said, it's even better to have the logs in advance, and we'll get to this later, but you can't make logs exist that you don't have. And people seem to just think you can magic logs into existence for whatever reason. I swear, if any of you want to start a business where you make logs for things retroactively, you're going to be the richest company on earth. Just that's a business idea. If you guys do that, just throw me a commission and we'll be good. But logs, they're really, really useful. They tell the story of exactly what's happening from a very, very detailed level. Just like this, servers walking, servers walking, servers walking. That by itself, really, really, really boring. But in the context of all of your servers walking, and then, maybe one of them falls down, trips, breaks a leg, network cable falls out, splits in half, whatever happens, we have a record of where that changed. And we can see Maybe not necessarily a single server crashing is a problem, or a single server stopping walking, but we can see the big picture when we start looking at logs at a more global scale. And yeah, these logs tell us exactly what's going on at any given point in time. Now, inevitably, people ask me, where do logs come from? Well, what happens, you have a daddy server and a mommy server, they love each other very much, and you get logs. But seriously, I am glad that you asked. Anything on your network that has some capability of doing something in some way can and will produce logs. You might just have to coerce it to do it. A lot of times logging is enabled by default. A lot of times some administrators don't know this and don't know what information is being collected. And with a little bit of optimization, you can even collect more and better and more useful logs. But yeah, when we look at it from an entire organization perspective, a lot of times one of the best sources of information about what's going on at a network-wide level is looking at your firewalls and your network devices to get started. Your firewalls will tell you what traffic is coming in and out. They'll tell you what's allowed through your organization's board boundaries. They'll tell you what systems and individual users are communicating where. You can identify a lot of information about potential malicious activity just by looking at firewall logs. And that's not even considering all the other sources of information that you can get as well. Network devices are also great because they can tell you things about routing changes. For example, in your routers, they can tell you information about switch ports going up and down. Did someone connect a device to the network? You have your wireless network devices that can tell you what users are authenticated, what MAC addresses are talking where someone's located based on what access points they're connected to. You look at that just from a network level, you can find out automatically where someone is in the building, what they tried to access, and network devices also have auditing capabilities to see if something changed. So you have a lot just looking at the network level, not even going into applications and clients and anything like that. Servers, they have all kinds of different types of logs, not just application and operating system logs, but other types of logs as well. For the hardware capability, if there's a problem with how much CPU is being used, there's information that exists in the web server for what types of traffic is coming in, what users are authenticating to the server, network shares, are they being utilized. That's just all information that can come from a single server. On top of that, your applications and your services have different types of logs as well. Now, these types of logs that the applications have are often you're at the mercy of the developer. Some developers are really, really good at logging things. Other ones really stink at it. And a lot of times, you look at something, makes perfect sense to the developer. We try to look at it from a security perspective or from the perspective of someone who's actually trying to, read what's going on. And they're like, what was this guy smoking? Happens sometimes. And there's things that need to be done often with these types of logs to make them make more sense for what application we're trying to look at. But just because something is producing a log, it doesn't mean it's not valuable. We have to understand what the purpose of it is and if it's something that will benefit our use case. There's also access control systems, and this really runs the gamut. You could look at your traditional authentication services, such as like your Radius and your LDAP systems, but you even can look beyond that. Think about walking into a building, for example. You have a badge or a key fob. You swipe that, you have an access log there of entering an area. You can use that data for not only determining if someone walked into the data center, but you can also see who is utilizing a space. Are you using the space that you have leased effectively based on just who's coming in and who's going? Also, your phone systems, they have logs, and we look at all the reports of the social engineering type things that go on. So often, you're looking at targeted type attacks where the users are being attacked not through something that is, a web page sort of thing. There might be a targeted email, but all too often you're seeing a phone call that comes in to try to either get someone's credentials or to just capture information. If we go back to the keynote even when they were talking about getting information to write a bad check, all you need to do is call up accounts payable, and they'll give you your routing number and bank account number. That's something that you can have a phone call record of to at least know this happened. And if you need to investigate it, you'll know who answered the phone call and where it came from. Also look at it from the customer service perspective. You have a customer that would call in from a phone number. That phone number is something you can associate to an account. That account might have orders associated with it that are placed through your website. All of these pieces of information you can tie to a single user and their transactions. There are so many implications for tracking down not only issues, so if a user has a problem placing an order, you would already know before the customer even calls you, but you'd also have the ability to look at potential fraudulent behavior. If the case you have an IP address, for example, placing orders that are associated with the same email address, all in a country that does not match where the order is coming from. So by kind of making sense of all of your online orders, for example, you can not easily, but you can at least look for patterns of organized crime and fraud. Email systems have a wealth of information. You can get a ton of details just from looking at email headers to see where emails are being sent from, types of emails that might look like phishing emails just based on the header information themselves as well. Now, there's things that can be done if you grab even more of the email, but what I find, there's concerns about the amount of data you're capturing for that and also privacy concerns. So I wouldn't say necessarily it makes sense to log all of the content of all of your email in a way that your security team can do that, because people might freak out a little bit and there might be some implications with that. But just by having details about who is communicating with who and where is that email coming from, you can get a lot of security information. And really, that's when the NSA, for example, talks about their metadata. That's a lot of what they're gathering. Antivirus software, I know it's often the butt of a lot of jokes in the industry, but at the end of the day, almost everyone has some form of client malware protection on their systems. If you have that to log when something happens, if it's not cleaned up, you can direct your service desk to, hey, this is a machine that needs to be investigated. But that information can be correlated with other pieces of information in other systems to get some more depth of knowledge. And also your IDS and IPS systems, those are kind of anything that your malware or your antivirus is not going to get, those will help see the outbound communication. And you can look at that combined with your firewalls as well. Because pretty much anything that's malware or malicious software is going to go out and try to talk outbound in some way. So if that traffic is getting somewhere, something on your network should see it, and you should be able to get a better idea by looking at, maybe there's an IDS alert, but you're also seeing something from that client getting blocked at your firewall as well. Hey, this is something that seems to be a legitimate thing that we need to investigate. As opposed to just, there was a malware scan and, it might be a false positive. But really, the thing to keep in mind is that almost anything does or can generate logs in some capacity. The trick is to understand what you can get from gathering those logs, what information you can find beneficial, and how it can benefit the security program that you're trying to implement. And I want to even encourage you to look beyond security program. Because a lot of us, we like to think of security as our own camp. We're the security people, we have all the cool toys and tools. But really, something like this has greater business implications. And if you're looking for trying to expand something into your organization, by saying more than security, our application team can use this to better improve how we handle site issues and application issues. Our customer service team can use this to better interact with customers. It's a much better business use case, and something that's easier to get funding for and support for in your organization. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about logs is they're machine data, and machine data is boring. Like I said earlier, our example of the server walking a bunch of times, that's not your Shakespeare or Charles Dickens novel. No one's going to read that except unless they need something to go to sleep. But there's plenty of industry white papers that work just well for that. So, you guys all realize logs exist, which is great. This is an example log from one of the systems that I had in a lab. We're going to just walk through this real quick so that you can see what a Linux system log looks like. Really, the question to ask is, what are these logs trying to tell me? And they're just a bunch of files going, hey, what's up? What are these logs trying to say? Well, if we extract this log file, we'll see a bunch of NTP synchronization events, where it's like, hey, NTPD, the NTP daemon is talking out to this random IP address. Now this random IP address. Then we look. Actually, I can magic writing on here, I think. Yeah. So we look there. There's an event for no servers reachable when there was an NTP failure. We see a couple other NTP synchronization events. So we wonder, like, well, why here was that not accessible? And then we'll see here at the bottom, there was a session open for user root. That might be a little suspicious, especially if you're not allowing root logins. So, maybe we're seeing a case, we don't know exactly what's going on looking at this individual server, but clearly, what seems to be normal behavior, maybe some network interruption, and then root login. A little interesting. But really, a lot of people, and probably even some of you, are thinking at this point, why should I care? Talking about logs, it's boring, and they're just telling me what my systems are doing. Why do I care? Well, really, like I said earlier, you can't retroactively make logs exist. So, if you need some kind of logged information for a breach that happens or some other security event, and you're not collecting it, that stinks. And you're not going to be able to get that information. You're not going to be able to solve your problem. So really, the time to think about these sorts of things is well before you run into a situation where you need the logs. You should understand your logs, have them, and be able to work with them so that when you run into a case where you need them, you're ready and prepared. So this is when I want to go back to some of the stories and continue where we left off, with a bunch of bad jokes included, if possible. So the situation that we talked about earlier, where, just to kind of bring you back up to speed, we had the firewall upgrade causing a denial of service attack, which at face value seems absolutely ridiculous. What we ended up working through for this sort of a case was starting by looking at the behavior of what we were seeing in our firewall logs. Because when you're having a lot of incoming traffic that seems to be crashing applications, that's going to be the boundary where most of that incoming traffic is going to happen. So looking through our firewall logs, we identified patterns of where this traffic was being sourced from. Quickly by seeing what IP addresses are sending the most traffic to me over this period of time. We identified a couple of interesting patterns. First and foremost, we were able to identify when that firewall upgrade happened based on ticket updates and seeing when this was cut over. We were able to demonstrate 36 hours of everything behaving normally after the firewall upgrade. No change between, new firewall and old firewall. And then a sudden change in the middle of the afternoon where this level of traffic started to happen. The other thing we noticed, looking at a lot of the IP addresses that were causing this, and we picked out a couple ones that looked interesting and were the source of a lot of the traffic. So this denial of service attack didn't really appear to be all that distributed. There were a number of hosts that were way off the charts for the amount of traffic that were coming in. So we took these IP addresses and put them into a sophisticated resource tool, or research tool, known as Google. And we were able to determine that these IP addresses were associated with a DDoS mitigation network, actually. Which kind of flips everything on its side. This was not a case where the organization that upgraded their firewall was getting DDoSed. They were participating in a DDoS because they had a public-facing website. Now, a lot of times what happens in a denial of service situation is someone will be the person that is going to be attacked. And you'll have a bad guy that wants that person to be attacked. And it's not practical for the bad guy to just be, on his machine sending traffic. He needs to use other things on the internet to do the denial of service attack. So he, of course, has a botnet, because every person who has an attacker, or is an attacker, they have a botnet. And this was actually using HTTP request instead of a different type of like NTP or DNS for the denial of service attack. So these were accessing this website with a spoof source address, the source address being the company that they wanted to attack, sending traffic to this company's public website. Web servers were acting like good web servers should be and returning traffic to where they thought the traffic was coming from. And that spoof source was receiving not only my customer's requests, but a whole bunch of other requests on the internet. When you have a flood of incoming HTTP return traffic that you didn't request, you are the recipient of a denial of service attack. So they were using a service to try to mitigate that by sending basically denial of service requests to the web servers that were sourcing this traffic to them. So it was kind of like we were in the middle of this, but it was bad timing. Now, by trying to figure out this sort of a situation by just looking through logs individually, it's not something you're going to be able to figure out in any reasonable length of time, being a person. So using log correlation tools and being able to simply understand where are the top sources of information coming from, what do these IP addresses do, we're able to figure out what was going on. Does that make sense? It's a really simple example, but it really shows just looking pretty much at firewall logs without any sort of really advanced correlation what you can do. That's really like a base use case for getting in some kind of SIM. This is a simple thing that you can do with it. So other situations that you see is, let's say you have an employee that, might be someone who could have the potential for taking some information. Let's just call him, Snowden, for example. He took some information that he probably shouldn't have. Let's kind of think about the situation of what he might have been doing. So, if you're someone who wants to take a lot of information from the government and share it with people, what do you need to do that? Like, it's not a trick question. If I need to take a lot of information, what do I need to have before I can take it? You need access to the information, sure. You also need to be able to collect all that information. So you need a lot of information to be able to give away a lot of information. And you have to be able to access all that information. So, now that we've talked about logging and you're accessing information, what is something that might happen when you're accessing information? Authentication, I heard. What was over there? Yeah. Authorization, yeah. So, when you're accessing a system, whether or not you have permission to do that, that's something that gets logged. So, let's just say, someone gave Snowden domain admin access, and he could access everything. Sure, the systems aren't going to stop him, but they should be logging, hey, you're accessing all these things. So we have access logs, we have authentication logs for Snowden accessing these things. He's probably going to more than like 1 or 2 file servers to get all this information, or we're all basically screwed if the government's putting everything on government file server 01. So he's probably hitting more than 1 file server, generating a lot of authentication attempts. Compared to, average IRS or, no one in Congress is actually accessing any files anyway. So their authentication attempts are just null. But like other people who actually do work in the government, like, you guys who are here working for Ohio's government in some capability, you do things. You access stuff, Like, you're the good side of the government that actually does those sorts of things. You do your job. You're going to be accessing things. But still, if you're trying to steal information from a wide range of systems, your authentication attempts are going to be way off the chart. Let's just assume also you want to take that information out of the system or out of the company's network. What are some ways that you might want to try to exfiltrate information? And let's not even think sophisticated. Like if I wanted to send, information somewhere, you could use Google Drive, you could use Dropbox, you could use email. granted, those are really not sophisticated ways to do it, but you could exfiltrate data that way. So let's look at it from the perspective of, we have an employee who has a significant number of authentication and authorization attempts and file share accesses. They're not even invalid ones. They're just a way off the chart high number. And we also have someone who's sending a lot of information to file sharing type sites. That's something that employee needs to be looked at as a potential source of either leaving the company or leaking information. And the only thing we've looked at, they didn't do anything like wrong per se, because they have permission to access those things by the access that's given. Now, granted, those permissions could be completely wrong, but they haven't violated anything that they were allowed to do by the software policies that were there. This is just looking for an anomaly and determining, hey, this is a problem. So that's something that can be done, and just kind of relating that to an example. Large amounts of other types of activity, such as web browsing, that's a interesting indicator based on what a system is doing. So you might be able to say, this user does this sort of behavior. Now, when you're looking at web-type traffic, you can use your proxy logs, you can use your firewall logs. But with a lot of traffic being HTTPS, and not always something that you want to decrypt for both performance and liability reasons, there are other ways that you can determine what's going on. A great example for that is using DNS. DNS logs are probably some of the easiest ones to generate and some of the or to collect, and some of the most powerful logs that you can have, as long as you can track the DNS request to the source of where it was created. So you look at a system that is making a DNS request out to something that is determined to be suspicious. How do we determine if something's suspicious? Well, domain names are things that people access from time to time. Like, for example, if someone goes to, Google.com, Microsoft.com, that's probably not going to be something that you see as very suspicious. That's normal. But if you see a domain request for a domain that's never been seen in your organization, and you look at when that domain was created and it was registered a day ago in Russia, it's probably not the coolest site on the internet that everyone should be going to right now. So a lot of times, newly created domains that are only seen once in an organization from a potential suspicious-looking registrar, like a randomized domain name, that can be something associated with malware. You don't need IDS. You don't need, well, you should still have those sorts of things, but you don't need them to say, just by a DNS request, this machine looks like it's doing something it shouldn't. That's really a source of grabbing that sort of information. Can any of you have other examples of things that you might be able to build upon this that you've seen that you want to share? Like I can think of many other ones where you look at access logs where people are accessing the building. You have your keycard logs. You can see where someone is going, and you can work with your security team not only from a network perspective, but also working with your physical security team as well. You look at the perspective of, we were talking about phone logs. You can say, this phone number keeps calling in all the time. When I see this phone number, I see my client access team doing some other behavior like resetting a password account. That phone number is not where that user normally calls in from. This is something that looks like it could be a phishing or a social engineering type thing. So really, there's so many different things you can do with this type of log correlation. And it's really, really fascinating. It's all about finding the things that make sense in your organization. I really encourage you to start small and go from there. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, what can I do now? I'm glad you asked. Most important thing, really, is to start to know and understand your logs. Understand where these logs are created in your company. Understand what information they're trying to give. Understand what information you might have that you don't know you have, or that you could be collecting that you're not. And these are areas where you can get more visibility into what you have into what you are doing. And then really ultimately get to the point where you're managing your logs. And having that, some central collection tool, whatever it may be in your SIM, to bring in all that data together. And then start understanding and using that security information to your benefit. And really, you're wondering, how does this help us? I always am kind of biased to the security approach just because that's the side I see the most. But really, we want to look at this from beyond the perspective of it just being something that benefits security. Think about the operational and other system administration benefits that you can have, and even some of the core business impact that you can have. If you can use a log correlation thing to improve your customer service, and you have phone support or just even a call center as a key component of what you're looking to do or what your organization has to do to support their customers, if you can improve that area, it's a win for your security team too. And the most important thing I always try to say is, security people, we have the reputation a lot of times as being the organization and the people that say no. And we have the people who are often seen as a roadblock in our organizations to be able to get things done. And I don't want us to have that bad rap. I don't want us to be the evil security people who are not the ones that are allowing the business to function while still keeping it secure. So if anything you take from this, understand that you should be the people who are understanding how to make things work. Yes, we can do something, but let's work together to make something secure. So please take that and kind of bring that on, because I don't want our industry to just be the no part, because we have that reputation all too often. So with that, I want to open the floor for any questions, and feel free to ask whatever, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much.